What if a guarded billionaire walked into her own home and found the quiet handyman cradling her baby, gently nursing her with a bottle? What if the lullaby he hummed wasn't just a song, but a bridge to a past she thought she'd lost forever? This isn't just a story about chance. It's about trust, healing, and the kind of kindness that changes lives. If stories like this touch your heart, stories of love, redemption, and the quiet miracles of everyday life, take a moment to subscribe to Soul Moments Story. It helps us bring you more tales that stay with you long after they end. The ocean wind had been restless all afternoon, rattling the glass panels of the grand Newport estate. Inside, the air was cooler, perfumed faintly with lemon polish and fresh lilies arranged in tall crystal vases. Isabella Grant's heels clicked sharply across the marble foyer as she returned from her charity luncheon earlier than planned. She had left her 1-year-old daughter, Ella, in the care of the nanny, certain the child would nap for hours. But as she passed the sweeping staircase, a sound stopped her cold. It wasn't crying. It wasn't the usual fussy murmur that came from the nursery when Ella was hungry or overtired. It was singing. A lullaby. Soft, steady, and wrapped in a voice so low and warm that it seemed to curl around every corner of the room. Isabella frowned, instinctively moving toward the sound. The song was old. She hadn't heard it in decades. Hush, little baby. Don't say a word. The melody reached into a place she had carefully locked away, back to nights when her mother's gentle voice had been the only shield against the loneliness of their vast, cold mansion. She slowed her steps as the melody grew clearer until she was standing in the open doorway to the sunlit drawing room. And there he was. Daniel Brooks, the new maintenance manager she had hired less than 2 weeks ago. In the file, he was 37, widower, former firefighter, the kind of man you expected to see fixing a roof or repairing a storm door, not sitting cross-legged on the floor, a baby nestled in the crook of his arm, a bottle angled perfectly in her tiny mouth. Ella's cheeks puffed gently as she drank, her eyes locked on his face, as if the world beyond didn't exist. Daniel's free hand moved with instinctive care, brushing a stray curl from her forehead. His voice never faltered as he sang, not loud, but with a tone that carried a weight of tenderness. Isabella's breath caught. He didn't see her. Not yet. She took a half-step back, unsure why she felt as though she were intruding, but it was impossible to look away. In that moment, the cold, careful lines she'd drawn around her life wavered. She'd told herself she was fine, more than fine, raising Ella alone. That her daughter needed structure, discipline, and the best care money could buy, not messy sentiment. But this was different. Daniel adjusted Ella in his arms, lowering the bottle for a moment. "Almost done, little one," he murmured, his voice a rough whisper edged with warmth. "Then we'll get you to sleep." Ella's hand reached up, tiny fingers curling around his thumb. Isabella's chest tightened unexpectedly, a memory flashing. Her own small hand wrapped around her mother's finger, the lullaby in the background, the faint scent of lavender soap. Her mother had been gone for nearly 30 years. She thought she had forgotten that night. That song. Clearly she hadn't. Daniel looked up then, startled to see her in the doorway. The song faded, but he didn't drop his gaze. For a heartbeat, they simply stared at each other. Isabella began, but the words tangled. She wasn't sure what she meant to say. "You shouldn't be here. How do you know that song?" Instead, what came out was, "Where's the nanny?" "She stepped out to take a phone call in the hall," Daniel replied evenly, shifting Ella so the baby's head rested on his shoulder. "She was crying, and I was nearby. I figured." He shrugged, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I figured she just needed someone to hold her. His tone wasn't defensive. If anything, it was matter-of-fact, like holding a baby was part of the day's work. Tightening a hinge, fixing a leak, comforting a child. Isabella's eyes flicked to Ella. Her daughter's eyelids had grown heavy, her breathing slow. The bottle dangled loosely in her grip. Daniel eased it away, set it on the low table, and continued patting her back in a slow rhythm until a tiny sigh escaped her lips. "You knew that song," Isabella said finally, her voice lower than she intended. Daniel's eyes softened. "Yeah, my mom used to sing it. Later, my wife sang it to our boy." His mouth twitched, something between a smile and a shadow. "It sticks with you, a good song like that." For reasons she couldn't name, Isabella felt the urge to tell him that her mother had sung it too, but the words stayed lodged in her throat. She didn't share personal history. Not with employees, not with anyone. "Thank you," she said instead. Her voice clipped, as if gratitude might give too much away. Daniel nodded, nothing more. He stood, careful not to jostle Ella, and carried her toward the nursery. Isabella followed without meaning to, watching the ease of his movements. When he reached the crib, he laid her down as if she were the most precious thing in the world. One last pat, a murmur she couldn't quite hear, and then he stepped back. In the quiet that followed, Isabella realized her heartbeat had quickened. Not from surprise, but from something subtler. An uninvited warmth, a flicker of trust she didn't want to acknowledge. She turned to leave, heels clicking once more. But the melody lingered, stubborn in her mind, weaving itself into the walls she had so carefully built. For the first time in years, Isabella Grant wasn't entirely certain those walls would hold. The morning after, the storm that had rattled the shoreline the night before had faded into a clear, brittle sky. Sunlight spilled across the estate's manicured lawns, catching on dew-beaded roses and the white columns of the front portico. From her upstairs office, Isabella watched the grounds below through tall windows, coffee cooling in her hand. She hadn't slept well. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Daniel in the drawing room, his large hands cradling Ella, as if they were made for that single purpose, the lullaby threading through the air like a ghost from her past. She told herself it was simply unusual, even inappropriate, for a maintenance manager to step into the nanny's role. But if she was honest, her unease came from something else entirely, the way it had made her feel. She set down her coffee and reached for the phone. "Send Mr. Brooks to my office," she told her assistant. 10 minutes later, a knock sounded at the door. "Come in," she called. Daniel entered with the quiet, unhurried movements of someone who'd spent years working in other people's homes. He removed his cap, nodding politely. "You wanted to see me, Ms. Grant?" She gestured toward the leather chair opposite her desk. "Have a seat." He sat, posture straight but relaxed, his hands resting loosely on his knees. She noticed the faint scars along his knuckles, the kind that come from hard work and harder moments. "I wanted to thank you for helping with Ella yesterday," she began. Her tone was formal, but the words held an undercurrent she couldn't quite hide. "Wasn't a problem," he said simply. "That song you sang." She hesitated, watching his expression. "You said your mother used to sing it?" A small nod. "Yeah, grew up hearing it every night. Later, my wife sang it to our boy. Guess it stuck with me." There was no embellishment, no attempt to make the moment more than it was. Isabella found herself leaning forward slightly, curious despite herself. "Your son, Ethan, is it?" 8 years old, Daniel confirmed, a flicker of pride softening his voice. "Good kid, smarter than me, that's for sure." Isabella almost smiled. "Almost. I didn't realize you were raising him alone." Daniel's gaze drifted to the window before returning to hers. "Lost my wife 3 years ago. Drunk driver." He said it without drama, the words steady but weighted. We've been figuring it out since then. She felt an unexpected pang. Loss was something she knew well, though she had never spoken about it to anyone outside her closest circle, and even that circle was small. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "Thank you." He didn't linger on it. Instead, he glanced around the office, taking in the neatly stacked papers, the wall of books, the absence of anything personal beyond a single silver frame on the far shelf. She noticed his eyes pause on it, her mother's photograph. "She looks like you," he said, nodding toward the picture. Isabella's breath caught. It wasn't a comment she heard often. Most people compared her to her father. "That's my mother," she said, her voice softer now. "She died when I was 6. Daniel gave a small, understanding nod, as though the detail explained more than words could. They sat in silence for a moment, not uncomfortable, but not exactly easy either. Isabella realized with some surprise that she didn't want to end the conversation. There was a steadiness to Daniel's presence, something grounded and unpretentious that made the air in the room feel different. She cleared her throat. "How are you finding the work here?" "Fine. Plenty to keep busy. Your East Garden gate needs a new hinge, and the guest house roof could use some attention before winter." Businesslike, efficient. A man who saw what needed doing and did it. But there was also that note of quiet observation, as though he noticed more than he said. Before she could respond, the baby monitor on her desk crackled, followed by Ella's cry. Isabella reached for it out of habit, but Daniel was already half rising from his chair. "I can check on her, if you'd like," he offered. She hesitated, then nodded. "All right." She followed him down the hall, curious to see how he would handle her daughter again. In the nursery, Ella was on her back, fists flailing in protest. Daniel leaned over the crib, speaking to her in that calm, low tone that seemed to carry its own kind of magic. He lifted her easily, holding her against his shoulder, rocking gently. Isabella watched as Ella's cries softened into hiccups. She was startled by how natural it seemed, how quickly her daughter relaxed in his arms. "You're good with her," Isabella said without thinking. Daniel glanced over, one eyebrow raised slightly. "You say that like it's a surprise." "It is," she admitted. "Not many people can calm her so quickly. Even I struggle sometimes." He adjusted his grip on Ella, the faintest smile touching his mouth. "Babies just need to feel safe. Doesn't matter who's holding them, as long as it's real." Something in the way he said it, quiet conviction, not arrogance, settled into her. When Ella had fully calmed, he returned her to the crib with the same care he'd shown the day before. Isabella found herself standing closer than she realized, close enough to notice the faint scent of cedar and clean laundry on him. They left the nursery together, their steps falling into an easy rhythm. "Thank you again," Isabella said at the door to her office. He nodded once, then tipped his cap. "Anytime, Miss Grant." And then he was gone, his footsteps fading down the hall, leaving her with the quiet hum of the baby monitor and a lingering thought she couldn't quite push away. Maybe some walls weren't meant to last forever. By midweek, the late summer sun hung low over Newport, staining the ocean horizon with streaks of amber and rose. The estate glowed in that golden hour light, its stone walls warm and alive in a way Isabella rarely noticed. She was in the library, reviewing a stack of contracts, when the faint wail of her daughter's cry drifted through the open doorway. It wasn't the sharp, high-pitched protest of being hungry. It was a tired, fretful cry, the kind that usually meant Ella's fever was creeping back. The nanny's hurried footsteps echoed down the hall. Isabella rose, her pulse picking up. By the time she reached the nursery, she found the nanny standing beside the crib, looking flustered. "She feels warm again, Miss Grant," the nanny said. I can call the pediatrician." Before Isabella could respond, Daniel stepped into the room, a small brown bag in hand. "Saw her rubbing her ears earlier," he said, his voice steady but gentle. "Could be teething or a mild earache. Let's check her temp." He crossed the room with an easy confidence that made Isabella step aside without thinking. Kneeling by the crib, he reached in and lifted Ella with practiced care, his hand supporting her head, his arm wrapping around her small frame like a shield. Ella's cries quieted almost immediately. Daniel pressed the thermometer to her ear, waited for the beep, and read the number aloud. "Slight fever. Nothing too high. If you're comfortable with it, I can show you a trick my wife used to do. Helped a lot when Ethan was teething." Isabella hesitated. Normally, she would insist on a doctor's visit for anything out of the ordinary. But there was something in his voice, not authority exactly, but the calm assurance of someone who had done this before, many times. "All right," she said finally. Daniel pulled a small, soft cloth from the bag, dipped it into a thermos of cool water, and wrung it out. Chewing on this helps soothe the gums and brings down the temp a bit. He sat on the rocking chair, holding Ella in one arm while offering the cloth with the other. She gnawed on it, frowning at first, then settling with a soft sigh. Isabella stood watching, arms folded, unsure what to do with the mix of emotions stirring in her chest. "You seem to have an answer for everything," she said, half teasing. He glanced up at her, a faint smile in his eyes. "Not everything, just some things that matter." For a moment, the room felt smaller, quieter, like they were the only two people in it. "How old is Ethan now?" she asked, more to fill the silence than anything. 8, Daniel replied. "Started 3rd grade last week. He's resilient. Smarter than me, and he knows it. Likes to pretend he's not watching, but he sees more than most adults." There was pride in his voice, but also a shadow, something unspoken. Isabella caught it, sensing a story beneath the surface. "And your wife?" she asked softly. Daniel's gaze shifted to Ella, still resting against his chest. "Her name was Laura. She was the kind of person who could make a room warmer just by walking into it. We met when I was still in the fire department. Got married 2 years later." His hand moved in slow circles on Ella's back. "She was killed by a drunk driver when Ethan was 5. 1 second she was there, and the next—" He stopped, clearing his throat. The house went quiet in a way I didn't know how to fix. Isabella felt an ache she hadn't expected. She knew loss, had felt it like a sharp edge for most of her life, but the way he spoke made it real, present. "That must have been unbearable." "It was," Daniel said simply. "But you don't get to stop when you have a kid. You keep moving, keep figuring it out, even if you're just putting one foot in front of the other." She wanted to ask how he had done it, how he'd managed to keep going, but Ella stirred in his arms, pulling their attention back. Daniel checked her forehead with the back of his hand. "Temp's already coming down a bit." The nanny, who had been hovering at the doorway, stepped forward. "I'll take her now, if you like." But Ella turned her face into Daniel's shirt, gripping his collar with surprising strength. Isabella caught the look of faint embarrassment on his face, but there was no mistaking the comfort Ella found in him. "It's fine," Isabella said, before she could think better of it. "She can stay with you a little longer?" Daniel nodded, settling back into the rocking chair. They stayed like that for a while, Isabella leaning against the doorframe, Daniel holding her daughter, the fading light spilling across the nursery walls. It was the kind of scene she rarely allowed herself to linger in. Quiet, domestic, almost intimate. When he finally stood to lay Ella back in her crib, Isabella followed him out into the hall. "Thank you," she said again, more sincerely this time. "Not just for today, for everything you've done for her." He met her gaze, his own steady and unguarded. She's easy to care for. Reminds me of the good parts. Before she could ask what he meant, he tipped his head politely and started down the hall toward the service wing. She watched him go, a strange tug settling in her chest. For years, she had told herself she didn't need anyone. Not for herself. Not for Ella. But as she returned to the nursery and saw her daughter sleeping peacefully, she couldn't shake the thought. Maybe some people weren't meant to be kept at arm's length. The following Saturday dawned crisp and clear, the kind of early autumn day that made Newport's air smell faintly of salt and wood smoke. Isabella had planned to spend the morning in her study, reviewing a major acquisition proposal, but Ella had other ideas. The baby was fussy, refusing her usual mid-morning nap, and the nanny was looking frayed around the edges by 10 o'clock. Isabella, frustrated, but unwilling to admit defeat, took the stroller out into the garden, hoping fresh air would soothe her daughter. Daniel was there, kneeling by the east gate with a toolbox at his side. He glanced up as the stroller wheels crunched over the gravel path. "Morning," he said, straightening. "Morning," she replied, adjusting the stroller shade. "Is the gate giving you trouble?" "Hinge is rusted," he said. "Been sticking for weeks. Thought I'd get to it before winter makes it worse." He stepped closer, his gaze flicking to Ella, who was fussing under her blanket. "She's not happy. She hasn't been happy all morning," Isabella admitted, surprising herself with the confession. Normally, she kept even the smallest frustrations to herself. Daniel crouched, bringing himself eye level with Ella. "Hey there, little one," he said softly. "You giving your mom a hard time?" His voice had that same steady warmth Isabella remembered from the lullaby, and she watched, almost disbelieving, as Ella's whimpers quieted. Daniel looked up at Isabella. "Mind if I try something?" She hesitated only a moment before nodding. He scooped Ella from the stroller with practiced ease, cradling her against his chest. "Sometimes they just need a change of scenery," he said, walking toward the vegetable garden at the far end of the path. Isabella followed, unsure why she didn't insist on taking her daughter back immediately. As they passed rows of neatly tended tomato plants and late-season herbs, Daniel pointed things out to Ella in a low voice. "That's rosemary. Smells nice, huh? And those are cherry tomatoes. We'll have to wait until next summer to pick them." Isabella realized she was listening just as intently as her daughter. There was something in the way he spoke, unhurried, deliberate, as if each word mattered, that felt like a bomb. They reached a wooden bench under the shade of a maple tree. Daniel sat, settling Ella on his knee. She was watching him now, her tiny hands patting the fabric of his work shirt. "You're good with her," Isabella said before she could stop herself. Daniel's mouth curved slightly. "You've said that before." "It's still true," she replied. He looked at her then, his eyes holding hers a moment longer than necessary. "Kids just, they see through you. If you're pretending, they know. If you're really there for them, they know that too." Isabella felt the truth of it settle in her chest. She had spent so much of her life pretending, projecting confidence, competence, control, because it was expected of her. But with Ella, there were no masks, no shields. And with Daniel, she was beginning to suspect the same might be true. She sat beside him on the bench, the crisp scent of the maple leaves above, mingling with the faint aroma of cedar that seemed to cling to him. "You must miss your son when you're here," she said quietly. "I do," he admitted, "but I'm glad he's in a good school. And this job," he glanced down at Ella, "it's not the same as being with him, but it reminds me what matters." Isabella hesitated, then asked, "Do you ever think about starting over?" Daniel's gaze flicked toward her, curious. "In what way?" "A new life, a new family." She wasn't sure why she'd asked, wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. He didn't answer immediately, his attention returning to Ella. Starting over's not something you just decide to do. It's something that happens when you find the right reason. She considered that, her eyes following the way Ella's small fingers curled around his thumb. A sudden gust of wind sent a flurry of red and gold leaves spiraling down around them. Daniel brushed one from Ella's hair, his touch gentle. Isabella felt the faintest crack in the wall she'd built around herself, a wall she'd thought was unshakable. They sat in companionable silence for a while before Daniel stood, handing Ella back to her. "You should get her inside before the wind picks up." Isabella took her daughter, noting the way Ella clung for an extra second before letting go. "Thank you," she said, and this time the words didn't feel obligatory. As Daniel returned to his work on the gate, Isabella wheeled the stroller back toward the house. She told herself she was just grateful for his help. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. Something about him was different, not just his patience with Ella, but the way he seemed to see her, the way he could be present without demanding anything in return. It was unsettling. And yet, as she closed the front door behind her, she realized she didn't want that feeling to go away. The rain began just after dusk, drumming steadily against the tall windows of Isabella's study. She sat at her desk, the soft pool of lamplight illuminating the papers spread before her. Ella was asleep upstairs, the nanny off for the evening, and the house was unusually still. She should have been reviewing a set of financial projections, but her mind kept drifting. It had been happening more often lately, these moments when her thoughts wandered to Daniel. Not just the way he calmed Ella or handled her with gentle certainty, but the way his presence seemed to settle the air around him. She had caught herself looking for him in the gardens, in the hallway, even listening for the low cadence of his voice when he spoke to the staff. A sharp rap on the window startled her, just a loose branch swaying in the wind. She shook her head and refocused, gathering the files to clear the desk. As she opened the bottom drawer, her hand brushed against a slim, leather-bound folder she didn't recognize. Curious, she slid it out and placed it on the desk. The label was faded, the edges worn. She flipped it open and froze. Inside were photocopies of news articles, official reports, and photographs, each one tied to a single event, a massive fire that had consumed part of the Grant family's Easton development 10 years ago. She knew the incident well. Her father had handled the fallout personally, paying settlements to several families who had lost homes, and one firefighter who had died in the blaze. The top page was a casualty list. Her eyes caught on a name she didn't know. Captain Samuel Brooks. Her gaze dropped lower. The attached report listed next of kin, Daniel Brooks. Isabella's heart thudded. Daniel had been there. He'd lost someone, his own family, in that fire. Why hadn't he said anything? She thumbed through the remaining pages. There were witness statements, speculation about faulty wiring in one of the newly built units, and hints that corners had been cut in the construction process. Her father's lawyers had managed to keep the company from taking formal blame, but she remembered the tense weeks afterward, the hushed conversations at dinner, the way her father's jaw tightened whenever the subject came up. And here, in her hands, was proof that the man she'd begun to trust, begun to let into her life, had a direct connection to that night. Her first instinct was defense. Had he taken this job to get close to her? Was his kindness toward Ella just a way in? The thought made her chest tighten uncomfortably. The study door creaked open, and she quickly slid the file shut. Daniel stood in the doorway, rain dampening the shoulders of his jacket. "Sorry to interrupt," he said. "I just came in to let you know the north gutters are clear. Shouldn't be any flooding tonight." She forced a polite smile. "Thank you." His gaze lingered on her a moment longer than usual. "Everything all right?" "Of course." The words came out a touch too brisk. She reached for her pen, pretending to make a note. "Good night, Mr. Brooks." For the first time since he'd started working there, he hesitated before leaving. She could feel the weight of his unasked question, but he said nothing, closing the door behind him. When he was gone, she opened the file again, staring at the name on the casualty list. Captain Samuel Brooks. Daniel's father? Brother? Either way, the connection was too close to ignore. The logical part of her mind told her she needed to ask him directly. But another part, the part that had spent years learning to protect herself, urged caution. She had worked too hard to build a life where she and Ella were safe from betrayal. She couldn't risk lowering her guard if Daniel's intentions were anything but honest. That night, long after the rain had stopped, Isabella lay awake, listening to the rhythm of the waves beyond the cliffs. She thought of the lullaby, of the way Ella reached for Daniel without hesitation, of the rare moments when his quiet eyes had seemed to see straight through her. She also thought of the file in her desk drawer, and the possibility that the man she was beginning to trust might have stepped into her life for reasons she didn't yet understand. By the time the first light of dawn filtered through her curtains, Isabella had made up her mind. She would keep her distance until she knew the truth. The change began the next morning. It was subtle at first, easy enough that Daniel might have chalked it up to coincidence. Isabella no longer lingered when they crossed paths in the hall. She spoke to him only about tasks, the garden gate, the leaking pipe in the guest house, the delivery schedule for winter supplies. Her eyes, once willing to meet his in conversation, now flicked away quickly, as though afraid of what she might see. Daniel noticed. He'd learned to read people in the fire department. Split-second assessments often meant the difference between life and death. And now, that same instinct told him something had shifted. On Tuesday afternoon, he was repairing the back porch railing when Isabella came outside with Ella in her arms. It was a warm day for October, sunlight filtering through the trees, the baby's hair catching gold in the light. "Afternoon," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. She gave a polite nod. "Can you make sure this railing is secure before the weekend? I'm hosting a small gathering." "Of course," he replied. He reached out toward Ella with a smile. "Hey there, little one." Ella's face lit up, arms reaching for him. But Isabella hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, before handing her over. Daniel felt the pause like a cold draft. He bounced Ella gently, murmuring to her, the way he always did. But when he glanced back, Isabella was already turning toward the house. No small talk, no shared moment. Over the next few days, the distance widened. She no longer invited him to join meals when he happened to be nearby. The easy rhythm they'd begun to fall into, the quiet conversations, the shared silences, was gone, replaced by a professional stiffness that felt foreign and unwelcome. Even Ella seemed to notice. The baby's eyes would track him whenever he entered a room, and her hands would reach, grasping at the air, when Isabella turned her away. By Thursday, Daniel couldn't ignore it any longer. He found himself standing outside the nursery, listening to Ella fuss, while Isabella tried to soothe her. "You've been restless all week," Isabella murmured to her daughter. Daniel stepped into the doorway. "Need a hand?" She didn't look up. "I've got it." The dismissal was soft, but final. He hesitated, then nodded and backed away, the ache in his chest sharper than he'd expected. That evening, over dinner in the staff kitchen, the cook, Mrs. Mallory, gave him a knowing look. "She's been different, hasn't she?" Daniel frowned. "You've noticed too?" Mrs. Mallory leaned closer, lowering her voice. "You've been good for that little girl, and for Ms. Grant, whether she admits it or not. Don't let a little frost scare you off. Sometimes people like her, well, they don't know what to do when someone gets too close." Daniel gave a short nod, though her words did little to settle him. The next morning, he decided to test the waters. Ella was in the stroller, fussing as Isabella prepared to take her out for a walk. Daniel, working nearby, crouched beside the stroller. "Hey, kiddo," he said with a grin. "Want me to walk with you?" Before, Isabella might have said yes without hesitation. This time, she hesitated, her fingers tightening on the stroller handle. "I think we'll be fine on our own." Daniel forced a smile, stepping back. "All right. Enjoy the sunshine." He watched them go, the sound of the stroller wheels fading down the gravel path. The ache in his chest returned, heavier now. That afternoon, he found Ethan waiting by the service gate after school. His son dropped his backpack onto the grass and leaned against the fence. "You're quiet," Ethan said. Daniel ruffled his hair. "Just thinking." "About her?" Ethan's eyes were sharp in a way that reminded Daniel of his late wife. "You've been different too. I like her, Dad, and the baby." Daniel crouched, meeting his son's gaze. "Me too, buddy. But sometimes, people pull back. Doesn't mean you did anything wrong." Ethan studied him for a moment, then shrugged. "Maybe she just needs to see you're not going anywhere." The words lingered with Daniel into the evening. He wasn't sure why Isabella had retreated, but he knew one thing. He didn't want to give her a reason to think he was anything less than honest. Still, as the days slipped toward the weekend, the air between them remained cool. The warmth of the garden bench, the laughter over small things, the unspoken trust, they all felt like they belonged to another time. And though Daniel didn't know it, upstairs in her study, Isabella sat, staring at the closed drawer of her desk, the file inside calling to her like a secret she wished she could unknow. By late Saturday afternoon, the sky over Newport had shifted from a soft gray to a brooding slate. The air felt charged, thick with the promise of a storm. Out over the Atlantic, dark clouds gathered like an advancing army, their edges lit in silver by the last rays of sun. Isabella stood in the upstairs nursery, watching the horizon through the wide bay window. Ella was on the floor beside her, occupied with a set of stacking blocks, oblivious to the change outside. The wind was rising, whistling faintly through the eaves. She had always liked storms, but tonight she felt unsettled. Maybe it was the restless way Ella kept glancing toward the door as though expecting someone. Maybe it was the way her own thoughts had been circling Daniel all week, no matter how she tried to push them away. The first roll of thunder came low and distant. The second was closer. Then the rain began, sheets of it, hammering against the windows, rattling the glass. Downstairs, the sound of hurried footsteps carried over the noise. Isabella picked up Ella, moving toward the hall just as the overhead lights flickered once, twice, then went out. The house plunged into darkness. From somewhere below, she heard the faint call of Daniel's voice, though she couldn't make out the words. The backup generator would kick in eventually, but until then, the mansion's long corridors felt like caverns. She turned toward the stairs, and that's when it happened. A sudden lurch, the floor beneath her shuddering as if the storm had reached inside the walls. It took her a moment to realize it wasn't the floor, it was the elevator. She'd stepped into it without thinking, cradling Ella, intending to go down to the kitchen. The doors had closed before she could react. Now the small cabin rattled violently, the control panel dark. "No! No! No!" She pressed the emergency button, but there was no response. Ella whimpered, sensing her mother's tension. She tried her phone. No signal. Her breath was coming faster when she heard it. Daniel's voice, faint but clear this time. "Isabella? You in there?" "Yes," she called, louder than she meant to. "We're stuck. The elevator." "I'm right here," he said. There was the sound of something metallic being moved, the scrape of tools. "Hold tight. I'll get you out." The minutes stretched. The elevator creaked in the storm's wind, every noise amplified in the dark. Isabella rocked Ella, whispering to keep her calm. Then, with a sharp clank, The top panel above them shifted. A beam of flashlight cut through the gloom. Daniel's face appeared, rainwater dripping from his hair. "Got you," he said, his voice steady. "I'm going to lower down. We'll take it slow." She felt the rope sway as he descended into the cramped space. The moment his feet touched the floor, something in her, tension she'd been holding all week, unraveled just enough to let in a rush of relief. "Here," he said, holding out his arms. "Let me take her first." She hesitated for only a heartbeat before passing Ella to him. His hands were warm and sure, even in the cold light of the flashlight. He looked at her. "Now, you." With his help, she climbed up through the panel, emerging into the dim hallway. The storm howled outside, lightning flashing against the tall windows. Daniel came up after her, Ella cradled against his chest, and only then did she realize she was shaking. "Breathe," he said quietly. "You're both safe now." She wanted to say thank you, but the words felt too small. Instead, she followed as he led them toward the east wing, where the generator's lights had begun to hum back to life. In the glow, she could see the wet lines of rain down his jacket, the grit on his hands, and beneath it all, the same steady presence that had calmed her daughter on the very first day they'd met. They stopped just outside the nursery. Daniel handed Ella back, but didn't step away. "Isabella," he began, "I don't know what I did to make you pull back this week, but I need you to know, everything I've done here, for you, for Ella, it's been real. No other reason." She gripped Ella a little tighter. Her first instinct was to deflect, to keep the walls up. But in the aftershock of the storm, with his voice steady and eyes unflinching, the lie caught in her throat. "Daniel?" She looked down, searching for composure. "I found something in my father's files, about the Easton fire. Your name was in it." His jaw tightened, just enough for her to notice. "Then I guess we should talk." Outside, the wind began to die, leaving only the steady rhythm of rain against the glass. They stood in the soft hum of the generator's emergency lighting, the air thick with the scent of rain-soaked wood and the faint metallic tang of storm water. Daniel didn't move, neither did Isabella. Ella's breathing was warm against her neck, the baby already drowsing after the scare in the elevator. "Let's sit," Daniel said quietly. His voice was calm, but there was a tension in his shoulders, a readiness that made Isabella's pulse quicken. She led him to the drawing room, where the fire in the hearth flickered weakly, still catching from the kindling a maid had lit earlier. Daniel removed his wet jacket, draping it over the back of a chair, and sat across from her. "You said you found my name," he began, "in a file about the Easton fire." Isabella nodded. "Captain Samuel Brooks, listed as next of kin, Daniel Brooks. I didn't know if he was your father or—" "My older brother," Daniel said. He didn't flinch as he said it. "Sam was 8 years older than me. He was the reason I joined the fire department. I wanted to be like him. Steady, reliable, someone people could count on when the worst happened." Isabella's fingers tightened on the arm of her chair. "I'm sorry." The words felt inadequate, thin against the weight in his voice. Daniel stared into the fire. 10 years ago, we got the call about the Easton development. New construction, multiple units going up in flames. We didn't know what caused it at first. I was on one side of the building, Sam on the other. He went in to make sure a family got out. The floor collapsed before he could get clear. He paused, jaw tight. By the time we pulled him out, it was too late. The fire popped softly in the grate. Isabella felt the heat against her skin, but inside she was cold. She remembered the Easton fire, the way her father had closed ranks with the company lawyers, the long nights she'd been told to stay out of the study. She'd never been given the details. They said faulty wiring, Daniel continued, his tone low. But off the record, there was talk about cost-cutting, cheap materials. I didn't know if any of it was true. I just knew Sam was gone, and the company responsible wore the Grant name. Her throat tightened. And when you took this job, I wasn't here for revenge, he said quickly, meeting her gaze at last. I'd left the department by then. I was just looking for steady work to keep Ethan in a good school. When the agency sent me here, I almost turned it down. But something in me, I don't know. I thought maybe I could finally see the truth for myself. Isabella held his eyes, searching for anything that hinted at deception. There was none. I know I've been distant, she admitted. I didn't want to believe you could be here for the wrong reasons, but you've lived in a world where trust comes with a price, he finished for her. She looked down, tracing the grain of the chair's arm. It's not just my world. It's my responsibility to protect my daughter, to protect everything. Daniel leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. I get that. I've spent years protecting my son from things he's too young to carry. I'm not here to take anything from you, Isabella. If anything, I want to give something back. She frowned slightly. Give back? He gestured toward Ella, now asleep in her arms. There's been enough loss between us. I figure maybe, just maybe, we could start adding something instead. The words settled in the space between them, warm and unfamiliar. Isabella studied his face, the steady eyes, the lines etched by grief and resilience. She thought of the way Ella reached for him, the quiet bond between him and Ethan, the countless small acts he'd never drawn attention to. The firelight flickered across his features, and for the first time since she'd found that file, the knot in her chest loosened. I believe you, she said softly. He didn't smile, not exactly, but there was a shift, a subtle easing of the tension in his frame. That's all I needed to hear. They sat in silence for a long moment, the storm outside beginning to fade into a gentle patter against the windows. Finally, Daniel stood. You should get her to bed. I'll check the rest of the house before turning in. As she rose, Ella nestled against her. Isabella felt an unfamiliar warmth, one that had nothing to do with the fire. It was the sense that something broken between them had been mended, not perfectly, but enough to hold. As Daniel moved toward the door, she stopped him. Daniel? He turned. Thank you, she said. The words carried more than gratitude. They carried trust. His nod was small, but certain. Any time, Ms. Grant. But as he left, she knew the formality in his voice was just habit now. Somewhere beneath it, something new was taking root. The morning after the storm, the estate woke to a sky washed clean, the air sharp with the scent of rain and salt from the nearby Atlantic. Sunlight broke through scattered clouds, turning the wet gardens into a glistening sea of green and gold. Isabella stood at the French doors of the dining room, coffee in hand, watching the staff move through the grounds. Daniel was out by the west lawn, inspecting a fence line. Even from here, she could tell his jacket was still damp from the dew. She caught herself lingering, not just watching him work, but watching how he worked, deliberate, steady, never cutting corners. It was the same way he had handled the truth last night. No evasion, no embellishment, just the facts, laid bare and honest. Ella babbled from her high chair, her little hands tapping the tray. Isabella smiled faintly and set her coffee down. Something inside her had shifted after their conversation. The mistrust that had built up like a wall had begun to crumble, brick by brick. By mid-morning, she made a decision. Daniel was tightening the latch on the west fence when he heard footsteps crunching over the gravel path. He looked up to see Isabella approaching, Ella in her arms. The autumn sun caught the warm tones in her hair, and for a moment, he forgot to speak. "Morning," she said, her voice gentler than it had been in weeks. "Morning," he replied, setting his tools aside. "Fence should hold through the winter now." "That's good," she said, glancing around the garden. "I was wondering, are you and Ethan free this afternoon?" Daniel blinked, caught off guard. "We are." "Why?" "I thought we could have a picnic, down by the South Bluff." She adjusted Ella on her hip. "It might be nice, for the kids, and for us." It wasn't lost on him that she'd said us. "I think we'd like that," he said after a pause. The South Bluff overlooked the churning blue-gray of the Atlantic, the cliffside dotted with late-blooming wildflowers. By the time Daniel and Ethan arrived, Isabella had already laid out a thick blanket, a wicker basket open beside her. Ethan's eyes lit up at the sight of the ocean. "Wow," he said, dropping his backpack and running to the edge, careful to keep a safe distance. "Stay back a few feet," Daniel called, smiling at his son's enthusiasm. Ella sat in Isabella's lap, clapping her hands as the wind tousled her hair. Isabella handed Daniel a thermos. "Hot cider," Mrs. Mallory insisted. He took it with a small smile. "She's got good instincts." The children played nearby, Ethan showing Ella how to stack smooth stones, Ella giggling every time the pile tumbled over. Isabella watched them with an expression Daniel hadn't seen before, open, unguarded, touched with something like longing. "They're good together," Daniel said quietly. "They are," she agreed. "Ella doesn't take to people easily. But with Ethan..." She shook her head, almost in wonder. "It's like she's known him all her life." Daniel glanced at her, the wind catching the loose strands of her hair. Kids don't overthink it. They just know who makes them feel safe. Their eyes met, and for a heartbeat, neither of them looked away. The afternoon passed in an easy rhythm. Shared sandwiches, stories about the children, and moments of quiet where the sound of the ocean filled the spaces words didn't need to. At one point, Ethan wandered over with Ella in tow. "She's getting sleepy," he announced. Isabella reached for her daughter, but Ella stayed put, leaning against Ethan's shoulder. Daniel laughed softly. "Looks like you've been replaced." "Apparently," Isabella said, smiling in spite of herself. She touched Ethan's hair. "Thank you for looking after her." Ethan beamed, and Daniel felt a swell of pride. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, they packed up the picnic. The walk back to the estate was slower, the air cooling with the approach of evening. Isabella carried Ella, who was half asleep, while Daniel shouldered the basket. Ethan skipped ahead, collecting leaves for some mystery project he refused to explain. Halfway up the path, Isabella spoke. "Daniel, I'm glad we did this." "Me too," he said, glancing over at her. She hesitated, then added, "I know I haven't made things easy. Trust doesn't come naturally to me." "I understand," he said simply. "But for what it's worth, I'm not going anywhere." Something in his tone, steady, unshaken, settled deep inside her. She didn't answer right away, but when their eyes met again, there was no wall between them. That night, after Ella was in bed, Isabella stood at her bedroom window, looking out at the moonlit gardens. Somewhere beyond the hedges, Daniel was likely finishing up his last rounds for the day. For the first time in a long time, she felt something she hadn't dared let herself feel. The quiet, fragile beginnings of hope. The first frost of the season had come overnight, dusting the lawns with a silver sheen. Inside the estate, the air was warm with the scent of cinnamon and baked apples. Mrs. Mallory had been in the kitchen since dawn, preparing for the small gathering Isabella was hosting that evening. Daniel arrived early with Ethan to help set up. Isabella met them in the foyer, a soft scarf wrapped around her neck. Ella perched on her hip. "Thank you for coming," she said, her tone carrying more warmth than formality now. "There's some heavy furniture to move in the parlor before the guests arrive. We can handle it," Daniel replied, glancing at Ethan. "Right, kid?" Ethan grinned. "You bet." By late afternoon, the house was alive with gentle conversation and the muted clink of glasses. Isabella moved easily among her guests, though her eyes found Daniel more often than she realized, whether he was helping an elderly neighbor to her seat or laughing at something Ethan whispered to him. Ella grew restless as the evening wore on, her cheeks flushed from the warmth of the room. Isabella excused herself and carried her daughter upstairs to the nursery. Daniel, noticing her absence, found himself drifting toward the staircase. He told himself he was just checking on them, but the truth was simpler. He wanted to be there. When he reached the nursery door, he paused. The room was dim, lit only by the soft glow of the night light. Isabella sat in the rocking chair, holding Ella close. The baby was fighting sleep, her small hands fisting and unfisting against her mother's sweater. Then he heard it. A familiar melody, hesitant at first, as if Isabella hadn't sung in years. "Hush, little baby. Don't say a word." Her voice was low, carrying the fragility of memory. Daniel stepped inside quietly. Isabella looked up, not startled, but as if she'd been expecting him. "She won't settle," she murmured. "I thought maybe—" She trailed off. He crossed the room, crouching beside the chair. "Mind if I help?" She hesitated, then nodded, shifting Ella into his arms. The baby settled almost instantly, her head tucking under his chin. Daniel began to sing, his voice a deep, steady hum that filled the quiet. Isabella watched him, the years between her mother's lullabies and this moment collapsing into something achingly present. When he reached the second verse, Isabella's voice joined his, soft at first, then surer. Their voices wove together, the harmony unplanned but natural, filling the nursery with warmth that seemed to push back every shadow. Ella's breathing slowed, her lashes lowering, until she was asleep. Daniel looked up, meeting Isabella's gaze. Neither of them spoke, but the air between them felt charged, fragile and whole at the same time. "You remembered," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never forgot," he replied. For a long moment they stayed like that, two people bound by a song, by loss, by the quiet realization that something new had taken root in the space those losses had left behind. Later, when they rejoined the gathering downstairs, the guests noticed a change. It was in the way Isabella's posture had softened, the way Daniel's presence beside her seemed natural, inevitable. Ethan sat near the fire with Ella in his lap, gently rocking her in imitation of what he'd seen Daniel do. Isabella caught Daniel's eye from across the room, and for the first time, she didn't look away. The song still lingered in her mind, not just as a memory now, but as a promise. The winter tides had shifted, bringing a pale, glassy calm to the waters off Newport. It was one of those rare December mornings when the ocean seemed to breathe in slow harmony with the land, the horizon stretching in a haze of gold. Isabella stood on the south bluff, her coat pulled close against the crisp air, Ella bundled in her arms. She'd come here often as a girl, back when her mother was still alive. It had been their secret spot, where they'd watch the gulls and imagine the ships far out at sea, carrying treasures from distant worlds. Today, she wasn't alone. Daniel appeared on the path, Ethan jogging a few paces ahead. He carried a thermos in one hand, a second coat slung over his shoulder. "Thought you might need this," he said, offering her the coat. "Thank you," Isabella replied, slipping it on. The warmth was instant, and not just from the fabric. Ethan crouched beside Ella's stroller, making silly faces until she laughed, the sound bright against the hush of the ocean. They stood there for a while, the four of them, letting the stillness wrap around them. It had been 3 weeks since the night of the lullaby. In that time, the easy rhythm between Isabella and Daniel had returned, only now it felt stronger, more deliberate. There were still walls, of course. You didn't tear down years of habit in a month, but each day brought small acts of trust. Isabella inviting Daniel into conversations about the estate, Daniel letting her in on Ethan's school projects, both of them sharing moments that might have gone unspoken before. What surprised Isabella most was how naturally Ethan and Ella had become a pair. He was patient with her in a way only a child who had learned empathy early could be. She, in turn, lit up whenever he entered the room. Today's outing had been Isabella's idea. "Before the weather turns," she'd said when she invited them. "And because I think we should mark this new beginning." The wind picked up slightly, rustling the tall grasses at the cliff's edge. Daniel glanced over at her. "What kind of beginning?" She looked at him, her eyes steady. "The kind where we stop circling around what's already happening." His brow furrowed slightly, a flicker of caution crossing his face. "Isabella." "I know," she said gently. "I know this hasn't been simple. And I'm not saying I've got it all figured out. But I do know this." She shifted Ella in her arms. "You've become part of her world, and mine, and I don't want to undo that." For a moment, all he did was breathe, watching her, as if committing every word to memory. Then he stepped closer, the sea wind pulling at his hair. "You don't have to have it figured out," he said. "You just have to keep walking forward." She smiled then, a real smile, one that reached her eyes. "Maybe we can do that together." Ethan came bounding up, cheeks flushed from the cold. "Can we go down to the beach?" he asked. Daniel glanced at Isabella. She nodded. "Let's go." The path down was narrow but manageable, winding through scrub and driftwood. At the base, the sand was damp and firm beneath their feet. Ethan ran ahead, combing the tide line for shells, while Daniel and Isabella walked side by side. Ella nestled between them. Daniel bent to pick up a small, perfect scallop shell and handed it to Ella. Her tiny fingers closed around it with a delighted squeal. "You know," Isabella said, watching them, "when I was a girl, I used to think these shells were messages from the ocean. My mother told me they carried whispers from faraway places." Daniel turned the shell in his palm, then pressed it gently to Ella's ear. "Hear that? Sounds like it's telling you a secret." Isabella laughed softly, the sound mingling with the quiet rush of the tide. As the sun edged higher, the chill began to lift. They found a flat stretch of rock where they could sit, Ethan showing off his collection of shells and bits of sea glass. Isabella leaned back on her hands, the sunlight warm on her face, and realized something. She wasn't thinking about the estate, or her father's legacy, or the walls she'd spent years maintaining. She was here, in this moment, with people who mattered. Daniel caught her watching him and raised an eyebrow. "What?" "Nothing," she said, shaking her head. "Just glad you're here." "Me too," he replied simply. When it was time to head back, they climbed the path slowly, stopping often for Ethan's important discoveries. At the top, they paused once more at the bluff. The ocean stretched endless and bright before them. Isabella turned to Daniel. "You said once that starting over happens when you find the right reason." He nodded. She glanced at Ella, then at Ethan, and finally back at him. "I think we found ours." For a moment, neither spoke. Then Daniel reached out, his hand warm as it closed gently around hers. The wind off the water carried the scent of salt and promise. Somewhere below, the waves kept their steady rhythm, as if marking the heartbeat of this new chapter in all their lives. And standing there, two adults scarred by loss, two children bound by laughter, they knew they had stepped onto a new shore together. We'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from today? It's always a joy to know how far these stories travel and how many hearts they touch. If you enjoyed this story and want more moments of love, kindness, and inspiration, please consider subscribing to Soul Moment Story. It's a simple way to stay connected, and it means the world to us. And from the bottom of our hearts, thank you for spending your time with us today. Your presence here is what makes telling these stories so meaningful.